Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Farley, and I work at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Dmitry Gorenburg, and I believe this is Dmitry's second appearance on Foreign Entanglements. And we plan to talk about U.S.-Russia relations and other Russia issues. How are you doing this morning, Dmitry?
I'm doing fine. Great to be on here.
Right. Could you introduce yourself? I failed to introduce you, so.
Sure. I'm a senior research scientist at CNA, which is a nonprofit think tank in D.C., and I'm also the editor of Problems of Post-Communism.
And in fact, you have really an excellent, I follow it mostly on RSS, but you have an excellent, both Twitter feed and an excellent blog, which contains a great amount of detail, and we'll have links to those in the side. So we're talking about U.S.-Russia relations, and we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of Russian military affairs a little bit later in the podcast. But it's not as if U.S.-Russia relations are ever that far from sort of mainstream media discourse, but we've been talking about it a lot in the last couple of weeks, obviously because of the Snowden affair. I guess to start off with, what are your thoughts on how relations between the United States and Russia, relations between these current administrations have developed over the past 3 or 4 weeks?
Well, I think it's been kind of an inevitable decline, I suppose, with the Snowden affair only being kind of, I think, the last straw in what's been a relationship that really has been struggling to find really a reason for maintain. The Obama administration, I think, has been struggling to find a reason to maintain more than just a pro forma relationship. The kind of the arms control agenda that once drove the relationship is kind of done, and other issues that have been kind of provided some reason for interaction have not been ones where there's that cooperation. I'm thinking of disagreements on Syria. It faded a bit recently, but Iran remains an area where the two countries disagree. So there's a whole range of issues that where the two countries really don't see eye to eye. And I think the cancellation of the summit that was announced recently had more to do with realization that really nothing good was going to be accomplished there, rather than the perception that there was going to be that the Snowden issue was going to derail everything. It was just, to me, it was more convenient excuse than anything else.
Right. I wonder, and one of the first things you said, right, that the Obama administration can't really sort through what it wants this relationship to be beyond a pro forma relationship. I guess the way that I've been thinking about it, and I'm kind of interested in your reaction to this, is that, and not just the Obama administration, but also the previous administration, really the entire American sort of foreign policy approach, has difficulty sorting through a logic or paradigm for U.S.-Russia relations. And I think it has largely the same problem with Beijing, but it really sort of comes out in Russia, where it seems hard for sort of liberal internationalist inclined administrations, and even to the extent that you would include both the Bush administration and the Obama administration, even previously. I mean, the Clinton administration maybe makes the paradigm work a little bit better just because of where Russia happens to be during this time. It's very hard in the framework that both Bush and Obama have chosen to view the world to understand and position Russia within that paradigm, right? A country that is, not a hostile rogue state, and not to be treated like a hostile rogue state as we sort of want to carve out a space for Iran and North Korea, countries like that, but that at the same time is quite clearly not with the same broadly conceived Western liberal internationalist project. And the Snowden thing sort of comes through in a fascinating way, in that so much of the rhetoric about the Snowden thing was so, me sort of fondly remembering the days of the Cold War, the notion that Russia could ever be bullied or intimidated into turning over someone suspected of espionage, an American suspected of espionage, just seemed so strange to me, right? I mean, not necessarily even absurd, but odd, an odd notion.
I think that the U.S. Foreign policy has a tendency to paint things in black and white. So it's really either for us or against us. And Russia really kind of has trouble fitting in because it doesn't necessarily do, it sometimes does bad things that kind of fit into this mindset. And given the Soviet legacy, people who think in those ways can just kind of find evidence in Russian misbehavior and say, oh, look, Russia's set against us. But really it would be if analysts especially kind of thought more about what the interests of the other side are and kind of put themselves into the shoes of those leaders of other countries, you see that they're maybe behaving quite rationally from their own point of view. So for Russia, it makes a lot of sense from in foreign policy perspective to support Assad. Given their view of the world, they don't see Assad as such a bad guy, and they see the danger of either radical Islamists coming to power there instead, or just chaos and civil war as potentially much more dangerous, not just to themselves, but to the region. And that's sort of where they're coming from. And from their point of view, the American support for the rebels is misguided, because you're basically trading in a stable, what was a stable regime that was certainly abused human rights, but it wasn't terrible from a Russian perspective, to one that could be much worse, and is certainly going to be a lot less stable.
Question on that. So when I think about the U.S. response to the entire Syria war, what comes out to me is really ambivalence, right? That the there's a lot of above board American rhetoric about the Assad stepping down and so forth, but the Obama administration, from my point of view, seems to be almost straining not to have to do anything serious in Syria. Is this how it looks to, asking you to speak for Russia, is this how it looks to the Russians, that Obama really doesn't want to do anything here? Or is the perception that the United States really is committed to regime change in Syria right now? Like, I guess another way to phrase this is, how does Russia read what looks like ambivalence on the part of the Obama administration?
Yeah. When this was starting a couple of years ago, there was certainly a perception among some analysts, I'm not sure about policy makers or leaders, but it's certainly analysts in Russia thought, oh, we're doing Obama a favor here, in that they're preventing, we're by vetoing the UN resolutions or whatever, we're preventing Obama from having to take action that he doesn't really want to take. So I think with now, with what's going on with Russian perceptions, is that they still don't really think that the U.S. is interested in intervention, because from their point of view, when the U.S. has been really interested in intervention, they've done it, regardless of any thing that stood in the way. So from that point of view, whether, I don't know if it's really anymore anyone's thinking of it that they're doing the U.S. favors. It's just that there's probably this is just me speculating, but I think there's a sense that this is almost a situation that suits both sides, where there's kind of a stalemate and nobody wins.
Right. Which is increasingly how the entire Syrian conflict is looking, right? A stalemate where
Right.
Nobody apparently is going to prevail anytime in the near future. So you think Snowden is just really sort of a stand-in for other significant issues? I mean, is there anything interesting in the way that the Snowden affair has played out in Russian domestic politics, or even sort of the Russian foreign policy apparatus? Are there, as far as you know, are there different views of Snowden in the Russian government or in Russian society, or how is he? What meaning has he?
Well, I have no idea about the government. First of all, it's not something I've particularly talked to anybody about, or there hasn't been any press on that. As far as society, there's this dominant perception that he's kind of a hero, right? That he's stood up to the U.S. He's exposing all these nefarious American programs. It kind of is. I mean, it's a little bit ironic, of course, because he's doing the kinds of things that, had anyone in Russia been doing to the Russian government, it would not have been particularly well treated. So there is that obvious irony there, and I think certainly the sort of the intelligentsia types recognize that, but the majority of the population doesn't really go too far into thinking about those kinds of minutiae. So there's a lot of popular support for Putin's actions in giving Snowden asylum. As far as I think, on some level, my guess is that the Russian leadership would have been just as happy if Snowden had never arrived. So he was. I do think that the U.S. government kind of made a tactical error in backing Russia into a corner on this. They would have been better off letting him move on to, Havana or Ecuador or wherever it was that there was a plan for him to go to, and not gotten U.S.-Russia relations dragged into it. There was somehow, for some reason, it seemed to me like there was more awareness of potential damage to U.S.-China relations, and so everyone was very happy when China
shuffled him along
when he left China.
Right.
But
I mean, the Chinese also had the Chinese also, just sort of the nature of the relationship between China and Hong Kong sort of gave the Chinese at least a plausible deniability in that, right? That he wasn't actually under the control of the Chinese authorities in a way that was far more believable than the notion that the Moscow airport was completely untouchable by Russian authorities.
Right.
All right. So beyond Snowden, there has emerged the issue of the anti-gay ordinances, anti-gay rhetoric, anti-gay laws in Russia, and the effect that they're going to have on the upcoming Winter Olympics. And in the United States, you're having calls for, not only are you having calls for the boycott of the Olympics, you're also having calls for the boycott of Russian products and so forth, like solely vodka and that kind of thing. And it's really sort of been very interesting in terms of the political coalition in the United States that's coming through to that. I guess, what are your thoughts on how this controversy has emerged and how it's developing?
One thing that I found was interesting, actually, since we're following this on from Snowden, is that it kind of, there were initial calls to boycott the Russian Olympics because of Snowden, and those kind of disappeared and were almost immediately replaced by calls to boycott the Olympics because of the gay rights issue.
But it's a different. It seems like it's a different coalition, though, right?
It is, but it seems to me that you can only, the media space for boycotting the Olympics can only seems to handle one issue at a time.
Right.
So the Snowden boycott people have disappeared, and are now, whenever the Olympics are all tied to Olympic boycotts, all entirely about the gay rights issue. As far as I think that this is potentially a big PR black eye for Putin, and my guess is that if they had recognized the extent to which this could become an international issue, they would have held off on the legislation. I mean, it doesn't cost them much to just wait a year.
Right.
But as with many things, they don't understand how these kinds of things are perceived elsewhere in the world. So
well, and in fairness, right? I mean, international perceptions on this issue are kind of a moving target, right? That things are different now in terms of how the United States and the international community think about gay rights than they were 4 years ago.
Of course.
They may, they would have been able to get away with something along these lines 4 years ago, not entirely unscathed, I don't think, but the consensus in both the international community and the United States and when we say the international community, I think we're talking specifically Western, in the United States and the Western community about gay rights has certainly grown stronger and more broad in the last 4 years, and so it is a moving target that they're trying to hold on to.
I guess the one thing that sort of worries me for the long term is that this is great that this has come up as an issue. What I don't want to see happening is that this becoming just purely because it's Russia, like what we were talking about before with the Dominican and fitting into the Russia is bad. Are we going to see calls to boycott the World Cup in Qatar in 2022, right? I mean, there are plenty of places around the world that are have very similar legislation, if not worse. And so I think Russia is somewhat unique in that it's a more kind of, it's closer to the West and maybe more developed than most of the other countries that have anti-gay legislation of this type or worse, but it's not unique, and so I would hope that this kind of thing continues and is not just an anti-Russian thing.
So I mean, it's also the comparison with Qatar and sort of other places that have. And I have no idea, like, what the state of these kinds of ordinances were in China in 2008. That's all I remember is nobody was talking about them.
Right.
But also the visibility of certain products and like how Stoli has become. Even though I think Stoli, like many of their operations aren't even in Russia anymore, but they're identified with Russia. How that's become a focus of the book. I guess one kind of odd thing from my perspective about the particular coalition that has come out around this notion of a boycott is that, I mean, these ordinances are obviously extremely troubling and are going to be really problematic for gay athletes and any sort of gay advocates who go to Russia in 2014. This is not really the first time that Russia has engaged in human rights abuses, right? I mean, that the Russian government has become engaged in some form of human rights abuses, which makes from the particular coalition we're seeing these calls emerge from odd, right? I mean, the Snowden boycott calls made sense, right? It was a bunch of people who've always really disliked Russia, finding another reason to dislike Russia. This is like, okay, well, the Chechen thing was fine, but this is what really, really causes us to boycott Russia. And so I can understand it on the one hand, but on the other hand, it also does seem very strange to me that this fits into this, as you suggested, this larger media space. That we only have enough space for one group at a time to call for a boycott of Russia. And, at this point, it happens to be gay rights activists.
Right, right, and it's sort of and I think it's spread a little bit beyond. It's not just gay rights activists. Right. I see a lot of people in the in the academic even community right. in the U.S. who would never go for a boycott on the sort of the Snowden lines or what the supported by the usual right wing types who are now out on social media reposting Stephen Fry's statement calling for a boycott or doing that sort of thing. And it's sort of, I think part of it is that there are people who know people in Russia who are affected. I'm thinking of like Masha Gessen's article. I forget where it came out, where she was saying that she is moving her family to New York because she's afraid that her children might be taken away as openly gay parents. That this is certainly a possibility, and so people know her and want to support her, and so you get this very different crowd than the usual kind of people who listen to John McCain and Lindsey Graham
right.
Crowd.
Right. How is it going to play? Do you get a sense of how it's going to play out in terms of how the Olympics are really going to go down? Or do you have any guesses as to? Are we going to see a broader, any kind of serious boycott, or I guess another way to phrase it? Do you think the Olympics
is going to be a? Sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
Go ahead. So I don't think there's going to be a boycott that sticks because that requires governments, and I don't think they're going to go that route. I think what we might well see are people sort of openly wearing rainbow flags, symbols to show support. The key question is going to be, what are Russian athletes going to do, right? Are they going to, because, the question is, what's the goal? If the goal is to sort of play to popular opinion around the world, then, anything anybody does, is great, right? You have a lot of athletes showing support, then that plays well, that shows sort of a breadth of support to the world. If you want to change the dialogue in Russia, then you need to get Russian athletes on board, because nobody's gonna. If you have an image where a bunch of American, British, French, German, whatever athletes are sort of wearing symbols that show support, and the Russians are not, that's just gonna kind of exacerbate the sort of the patriotic angle, right? And not really change minds in Russia, and also not really put much pressure on Putin and company to change the laws.
Right, and
so that's
you might even see a sort of backlash in terms of the Putin's position is not quite almost was solidified as one way of phrasing it, right? But it's turned into a patriotic position, right? It's turned into a
that's right.
Position.
Well, and that's I think where he is from the beginning, right? He's there because he's written off the sort of the liberal intelligentsia and is focused on support of the sort of his core electorate, as it were, the small town kind of fairly conservative folks who, last thing they want to, change their mind on is gay rights, right?
Right, exactly.
So we'll see, I think, how this plays out. But I really doubt that any countries are going to initiate a boycott over this, just because there's too many other, people I think have bad memories of the boycott era of the Olympics.
Right.
And don't really want to go that route if they can avoid it. And by people, I mean, sort of the officials.
Does this...
both government officials and sports officials.
I wonder, and we may be running up against here, but I wonder if the IOC is going to increase it. Well, the IOC is sort of irredeemably corrupt in the first place, but if it's increasingly going to become very careful about how it treats bids now moving forward because of the threat of things like this. And I guess this gets back to the Qatar issue.
Exactly. Well, Qatar, I mean, that's FIFA, which is, if there's one organization that's more corrupt than the IOC. But yeah, I think that there will certainly be questions about how to assign future events, and at the same time they'll be in a position where if they don't want to just assign events to the quote unquote first world, right? They'll have to make some.
They'll have to make some choices, right?
Make some compromises.
Right. All right, so let's wrap up by making I think a substantial shift from the Olympics and gay rights to a conversation about what the Russian military and is doing right now, and what the Russian military is doing in terms of the sort of exercises that it's pulling off. And I think you and some other people have written about how not only have there been some sort of more and larger and more interesting military exercises happening, but the character of those exercises has recently changed. So maybe actually, could you clarify that or explain what I'm talking about?
So there's two. The traditional Russian military exercises were these long, big exercises planned long in advance, where everyone knew what was going to happen months ahead of time, and it was all carried out, and just like a well choreographed play. Hopefully, sometimes things didn't work, but by and large, and the idea was to impress the generals with lots of flashbang and big artillery and that sort of thing. What they've started doing in the last 6 or 8 months, soon after Shoigu became defense minister, is sort of sudden announcements of checks of readiness checks, basically, for some set of units or a district, or in the most recent case, it was actually troops from 2 districts. And so that is arguably a better, the goal is to provide a better sense of how ready these units actually are to respond to a real-life emergency. So if somebody invades us tomorrow, are the troops going to be ready to go? Can they be sent from the Urals to the Far East, for example, and how quickly, without months and months of advanced planning? So that's been kind of the new development.
And what is what have these really turned up so far in terms of what readiness looks like, or have we seen surprising results of these surprising inspections?
There have been, picture's been mixed. There were certainly some successes. The most recent such exercise was in the Far East, and one thing that they said worked really well was the ability to transport troops by railroad. They said they went, according to the official assessment, they transported them twice as fast as they were expecting. So the things that have gone wrong, there was one case where the base in Tajikistan, one of the few Russian bases abroad, basically didn't get the alert because they depend on Tajik electricity supplies, and they have rolling blackouts, so they were out of power, and and they had no sort of battery backup ways of being contacted. Yes. So that kind of showed the kinds of things that need to be remedied. One other thing that sort of shows that the old mindset is still well entrenched is that after this most recent exercise in the Far East, the MOD announced that this was the largest exercise ever. It was 160,000 troops and so forth. But the MOD put out all these slides that they shared with the public about how many troops were involved and how many tanks and the usual kind of Soviet legacy. quality assessment by, the sheer amount of metal moved and people roused and that sort of thing. And talking to people who were observing these exercises, that, a lot of these numbers were very much inflated. So if you say 160,000, that just kind of lists all the units that were, that's the number of people, personnel in all the units that were listed as participating. Now, from each unit, let's say if it was a brigade and maybe a battalion or a company went or something like that. So the actual number of people involved based on how many people were transported, which is maybe a better assessment than just it was more like 15,000 rather than 160,000. So there is still this. There's a good Russian word for it, pokazucha, which means kind of showing off. So trying to impress the senior leadership by using big numbers. So that kind of thing's still going on. I think nonetheless, I mean, there's certainly many things to criticize, but the general trend is a good one. And if troops, if unit commanders are aware that this sort of thing can happen any time, then theoretically, at least, they'll be on, they'll be on their toes and they'll be better prepared if an actual.
No, I mean, what we've talked about, most of what you mentioned seems very sort of Army land oriented. Are there sort of similar developments in the naval and air forces?
Yes.
Forces?
Oh yeah. So the same kind of thing was, all of these exercises are now being done very much jointly because the military districts are now being, they're sort of the equivalent of, in some ways, of the U.S. Regional commands. So the commander of the East District is responsible for ground, air, and navy, not strategic rocket forces, but ground, air, and navy, and some airborne units in their territory. So these exercises that I mentioned all involved air and navy units, and not just so for air. This include both military transportation, so to bring the ground forces to places, but also combat aircraft as well, and helicopters or army aviation. So they are using very much combining different services in the exercises.
Right, which probably, plays the additional positive role of preparing those different elements to cooperate with one another on a short-term basis rather than sort of a long-term planning out basis.
Right.
All right. Well, I think we're going to close it at this, and we apologize for any technical difficulties, but I think we have enough. Actually, pretty interesting stuff that this is made for a short but entertaining blog yet. So, Foreign Entanglements viewers, thank you for watching, and Dmitry, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah, definitely.